All right. Well, it is indeed past 1 o'clock, so we'll go ahead and begin with today's webinar. Again, thank you all for joining us for today's webinar, Death Notification When Children Are Involved, Trauma-Informed Strategies for Delivering the Most Difficult News. This webinar is brought to you by the International Association of Chiefs of Police. My name is William Moore, and I'm with OJJDP's INTAC, also known as the National Training and Technical Assistance Center. And as your technical host, I would like to take a couple of minutes to discuss a few features of Adobe Connect to keep in mind. Please note that this event is being recorded and will be published on INTAC's YouTube page. The webinar recording will be archived on INTAC's YouTube page, where you can also view past webinars. And for the event transcripts or event supporting materials, please contact the OJJDP TTA Help Desk. For those wishing to download a copy of today's presentation, you may do so by locating the Handouts pod directly above the chat area. Here, you will also find an FAQ for the webinar participants that will likely address any technical-related questions. Simply click on the file name and then click the download button. During today's webinar, questions will be addressed during our Q&A segment, so please be sure to type in any of your questions into the chat box, and they will be addressed as they arise. For those of you participating in today's webinar as a group, please help us count, or take a minute to help us count. Please type in the total number of additional people in the room with you today. If you're viewing alone, there's no need to type anything at this time. Again, type in the total number of additional people in the room with you today. If you're viewing alone, there's no need to type anything at this time. Following today's webinar, attendees will be sent a certificate of attendance, and this certificate is sent approximately 1 hour following the conclusion of the event and is sent via an Adobe Connect thank you email. Please be sure to keep an eye out on your thank you email for your certificate, and also note that only participants who are registered and signed in will receive the certificate of attendance. At the conclusion of today's webinar, you will be provided with a link to a brief survey about today's presentation. If you could please take a few minutes to provide information asked during that survey. And this survey will indeed help us with future planning and training for our webinars. I will now turn today's webinar over to our moderator, Tiffany Garner, for today's presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, William. Good afternoon to everyone. I would like to welcome you all to today's webinar. I will be your moderator for today. I'm Tiffany Garner, and I work here at the International Association of Chiefs of Police, working on 2 grants here, Children Exposed to Violence, and a grant entitled Community-Based Crime Reduction. I'm going to introduce to you all our 2 presenters for today. We have, first off, Chief Stephanie Reddy. And I'm going to share a little brief bio about each of our presenters for today. So Chief Stephanie Reddy, she began her career with the New Haven Police Department in January of 1986. Upon graduation from the Police Academy, she was assigned to community patrol operations, where she worked as a patrol officer and later in the Mounted Patrol Unit. She was promoted to the rank of sergeant in November of 1994. As a sergeant, she served as a supervisor in both the Patrol and Communications Division and was district manager of the East Shore Morris Cover District from September 1996 to June 2001. In August of 2000, she was promoted to the rank of lieutenant, and her assignments included Deputy Community Patrol Resource Coordinator and officer in charge of the Family Services Division, which investigates matters relating to domestic violence, sexual assault, juvenile crime, missing persons, hate and bias crimes, and child abuse and elderly abuse. In August of 2006, Reddy was appointed to the first female assistant chief of the New Haven Police Department, where she oversaw the administration. Our second presenter for today will be Dr. Stephen Marins. Just a little bio about him. He is the director of the Childhood Violent Trauma Center at the Yale Child Studies Center and the Harris Professor of Child Psychoanalysis and Professor of Psychiatry at the Yale School of Medicine. He is founder of the Child Development Community Policing, that's CDCP program, a model for police mental health collaborative responses to traumatic events that has been replicated and served as a model for similar programs in communities around the U.S. and abroad. Dr. Marins is also co-developer of the Child and Family Traumatic Stress Intervention, the only evidence-based early trauma-focused intervention for children and families that interrupts and prevents the development of PTSD and related disorders. He is also the co-developer of a nationally disseminated toolkit on trauma-informed policing. I would like to welcome these two presenters today, and I would like to first turn it over to Chief Stephanie Reddy, who will start us off with her presentation.
Thank you, Tiffany. Good afternoon, everyone. We are just so happy to have everybody and see people from all around the country to be part of this death notification seminar. Obviously, the principles and practices of death notification is a difficult subject for law enforcement. Notifying the next of kin, family members, that a member has died in their family is very difficult. And it's one of the duties that I think officers dislike the most. It's very, very difficult to do. We are frequently, however, called upon to do this. Well, some agencies would have those at the supervisory level do this task. In many departments, either the circumstances or that it's a smaller agency, they don't have that luxury to have just one person do it, that officers on all levels have to provide a death notification. So we'd like to give this seminar in order to give some good principles and practices in order to provide this task a better background and some more secure, I would say, feeling of going out and doing this with families, that you feel a little bit more, I don't know, like more compassionate, more empathetic, and why this is so important to do it in that manner.
So I would just add that it's not only difficult for police professionals, but for anyone who's engaged in the activity of doing a death notification. And actually, one of the biggest burdens, I remember the first time many, many years ago when I was tasked with this, I'm hesitating, but this job of notification. And I remember driving on the way to the scene where I was going to inform family members about the death of a loved one. And I remember the thought that just kept going round and round in my head is, what am I going to say? What am I going to say? And I was quite aware of how anxious I was and how awful the task before me was feeling. And I realized that actually it's not so hard to understand why. And by understanding why it's hard helps us be better prepared to carry out a role that indeed is extremely important. And one of the things that makes it so hard is that we can all imagine the experience of receiving such news. And we can all imagine the horrifying and overwhelming feelings that we ourselves might have if we were to receive such sudden news. And the next piece that comes into mind about what am I supposed to say often includes the idea of the wish to make it better for someone. And I think that this can be a burden that is unrealistic and can actually interfere with our being able to perform our task in a way that is going to be most helpful given the circumstances that the family is dealing with. So the principles that we're going to review today are ways that we've learned over many years of working together, both Stephanie and I and many of our colleagues who have been engaged in this activity, and to share with you some of what we've learned.
Absolutely. Stephen and I have done this many times over the years, and we've trained officers in New Haven Police Department in these principles, because we know that this is something that many officers are just not confident doing and have maybe not intentionally, but a way of minimizing or trying to minimize the impact of the words that they're about to and the news they're about to give, not because they don't care about it, but it's just very difficult news to give, and it's an uncomfortable situation for officers to be in. So our objectives for this webinar, we're going to describe the key principles and challenges involved in death notifications and describe the key elements of the implementation of death notification.
So how many people have actually had the experience of doing a death notification?
And for our audience with the poll questions, please feel free to select the bubble or the circle right next to your answer. All right, and Stephen and Stephanie, it looks like we're at about 50% who said yes and 50% or 49% who said no.
So we will look forward when we finish our portion of hearing from both sides of the experience and no experience in terms of issues that have been most challenging or the issues that one anticipates as being most challenging. Okay. So I think if we'll move on, but in the meantime, the other poll question is, what are some of the challenges you faced in doing death notification? And if people could, briefly write some of the biggest challenges, that would be great, and we'll be able to return to those and weave them into our discussion following our brief presentation.
For our audience, you can type in your answer into the box that is below the question. Simply take your mouse, place it inside of the box, type your answer, and hit enter. And we'll give folks just a couple of minutes to go ahead and provide their answers. And again, for our audience, simply click the box where it says type your answer, type in your answer, and then hit enter, and it will be submitted. And we'll give you guys about maybe 15 more seconds. Great. It looks like we have about 50 or so people submitted their answers. And for our presenters, you can, as you can see, scroll up and down and see some of the answers that have been submitted. Okay. Would you all like me to go ahead and close out the poll?
Yeah, and we'll come back to these, and if they're not being addressed, we'll have an opportunity after we conclude our presentation to address some of the specific questions that we did not get to.
So our overarching principles of death notification, and like Dr. Marin said, there were so many things, we were reading them very quickly, but shaking our head as we were reading them, because those were some barriers and things that we came up against while doing this. So we're really looking forward to discussing those a little bit later. Plan ahead, plan being the optimal word, and prepare. In pairs, in person, in time, in a timely manner, in plain language, and with compassion and with empathy. So planning ahead. I would say it's so important to create a plan with your partner or partners who are going to deliver this news with you, which includes get all the vital information, who it is, who are the next of kin, where is the body, the effects, what information you can and cannot provide, where to provide it. Those are some of the things, just some notes like to put together before you go in and do this. Stephen?
And having worked in this area together for a long, long time, and I think some of the comments that people were making about the upsetting nature of the task itself and what it stirs up in us, it makes a lot of sense that the more affected or upset we are in reaction to the task at hand, the more narrow our thinking becomes. So the number of times where we've consulted with or supervised our colleagues who have been, gone off to do the death notification, and if, just when they're driving over and we're talking to them, actually asking them, what do you know about the current status of X, Y, and Z? And, often a somewhat startled response of, my goodness, I didn't think about that, or I didn't check and I didn't know. So even as Chief Reddy was pointing out, when you don't have information, or the information is limited, that's an important thing to convey, but actually realizing that part of what people are going to look to you for is whatever information you have means find out as much as you can before you go.
Prepare. And even with that said, we can have as much information as we can gather between us, and also gives, for me personally and our officers, it gives us a chance to talk it out, like almost scripting in a way what we're going to say. It gives us a chance to prepare with each other, which helps clear your mind, and it also helps you with your emotions. And I saw that a number of people had typed in to that poll question about controlling your own emotions. If you've had a chance to talk it out with a partner and really talk about what you're going to say and how you're going to say it, and make sure you both know the facts, it really helps on scene to be honest, direct, and be in that supportive position that you're there for. You're there to give the information, there to give the facts, but also to be supportive, empathetic, and be honest as you can. And you don't know when you get there, though. One of the things we don't know, with as much planning as you can do, you don't know what you're going to walk into. Most of the time, you don't know. So again, in talking about being prepared, be prepared for a range of questions. We go through as many things as we can think of that people may ask. Know your community. You should have a list of who your support services are. All officers should know that, and your partners as well. Make sure that the person, or try as best can, that that person has a support, a friend or family member there. Make sure you have a card to leave with information so that they can reach you, and if it's possible, to follow up or have your partner follow up in the days after the event.
I think, a lot of times when one arrives at a scene, you don't always know what the setting, what's going to be confronting you. And as somebody noted in the online comment about, the idea that given today's social media, there are many times when we arrive and have arrived where the family actually has, if not all of the information, some of the information, and one can often arrive to a scene where one's hoping to do a private, quiet notification of the death of a loved one, to find a large gathering of friends and family already convened. This can often be somewhat chaotic and not as easy to respond to, but keeping in mind that the idea of helping the identified, first of all, finding out who you need to be talking to, and then seeing whether there is enough of a contained private setting in which you will deliver the formal notification of the death to the key family members.
I'd say that grief has many manifestations, and as many officers know, sometimes we become the target of their grief and upset. They're looking for someone to blame, and again, that being prepared ahead of time helps your emotions and understanding that you can be the target of that. And although you may not be able to control all scenes, to be able to be in control of yourself and your officers and your partners and try to bring the family to a place that's private, try to keep things more calm as you can. May not always happen, but at least that you've talked about it and you're prepared for that type of situation.
And I think given the frequently occurring or natural phenomena of, as Chief Reddy was saying, the range of emotions, that they do include anger, that they do include often, the possible hostile, verbal abuse. Why did you let this happen? Why weren't you doing your job? Why didn't you save my loved one, etc. That no one in any professional role likes to be yelled at, especially at a time of great upset and grief that you're trying to help somebody through. I think the idea of stating the obvious, that this is part of the range of human responses, can help the officers involved in the notification recognize that this is not personal, and that this is one of those times where they can predict and anticipate that this response is one amongst many that are possible.
And in terms of the social media, we all understand that that's now something, this phenomenon is very different from, before. We get to a scene and people have all types of information that they've gotten from social media. Remember that a lot of it could be incorrect information. It's our job to, as quickly and as clearly as possible, to clarify what is true and what isn't true. They may know that the death has occurred, but as we all know, sometimes that these rumors go like wildfire on social media, and it's our job to really make sure that they understand what is actual real information. So, in pairs, in person, in a timely manner, in plain language. Try to request to speak to the immediate survivor of the person receiving the notification. Identify yourself and your partners. They may know who you are, or you're easily identified by your uniform or badge, but your partners may not be. Make sure that you present who your partners are. Verify the relationship of the survivor to the deceased. Again, just being careful. Avoid delays in notifying the next of kin. Try to do this in as timely a manner as possible. It's very critical in this area, again, of social media. So avoid attempts to use cliches such as, I know how hard this must be for you. I know how you must feel. It's easy to do that, and it's only because it's our own emotions that we're just trying to identify with them and be compassionate. But they may take that as being, no, you don't. My next of kin has just died, my father, my loved one. So that may not be the most appropriate thing to say at that time.
Yeah, again, I think that one of the dilemmas is being the messenger. And no one likes to be the messenger of bad news, but it's important that when partners involved in doing death notification, that they can explicitly remind each other that they're not the ones who are causing the information, they're the ones who are delivering it. And again, being able to tolerate that there are times in life that are going to feel overwhelming, and the grief will be quite acute, that this is not something that one is tasked with alleviating. And it's actually your presence will often be an important anchor in not being caught up in the same level of distress and despair. and the overwhelming feelings that often accompany such news, and that posture of strength and consistency and being even-keeled can be an anchor that many people find enormously important in the midst of their feeling the intensity of the feeling they're feeling. There are times and circumstances where, again, one of the most immediate things one wants to do when someone is having a very powerful reaction is, this is about timing. It's one of those opportunities to say, who can be with you now? Whether it's a clergy person or whether it's a close friend or a relative. And there are also some techniques and tactics that we can talk about as they come up for those situations where the level of distress is really incapacitating or immobilizing somebody's ability to communicate with anyone around them.
So notifying children, and I did see in the poll a number of people have some commentary about how difficult it is to notify children of the death of their parents or a loved one or a caregiver. One of the things you'd like to do is to encourage family to think about what words they want to use and help them be able to talk to their children. Talk with the caregiver in preparation about the message that might be, that messages that might not be helpful. Offer support to the caregiver if they would like it while they're providing the news, for example, or by being nearby, or just to help them through how they're going to do this. It is difficult. It's difficult for officers, and again, I saw that in many of the poll responses, people's commentary about how difficult this is. I would say, having done this myself, it's one of the most difficult things I've ever done, and it has stayed with me to this day. So the more prepared I feel I am going in and knowing that I have a partner to share this burden with, the better I feel about the notification that I'm doing.
And the distinction that Chief Redding was making, it is, in our experience, it's the more rare situation where one is needing to inform a child of the death of a family member in a complete vacuum of other adults who are known to the child. So I want to start with when we're actually participating in a discussion with a child. What Chief Redding was referring to is actually talking to the adult caregiver about what they have in mind in terms of telling the child. And often parents, especially when they themselves are caught up in their own grief-stricken reaction, will often say, I don't know what to say. And obviously, depending on the age and developmental phase of the child, the responses can vary. But we can, again, convey to caregivers some basic ingredients, like giving the information in a straightforward way with very simple language, and don't assume that the child is necessarily, just like adults themselves, are always going to be able to take in the information in one fell swoop. Keeping it simple and short and helping and monitoring that someone has actually been able to hear the information you've given is the first essential step. The second is, don't presume that you know what is going to be uppermost on the child's, or for that matter, the adult caregiver's mind. Too often there is the burden and the sense of urgency on the part of the person doing the notification to give a lot of information at once. The first part is actually being able to make the official statement about the death, and to, again, be able to tolerate what the reaction is, and to be prepared to offer some of the things that Chief Redding was outlining. The second is waiting to see what questions the adult or the child have, And here in talking with the caregiver, we're actually counseling them, advising them to listen carefully to what the questions are that are uppermost on the child's mind. And it's with that the questions may go in different directions. We've had experience where both caregiver and adults we immediately anticipated or expected that they would want to know all the details of what happened, and that wasn't actually what came up. In one case, I'm thinking about what immediately came up was, you know, where are we going to get food from? Because this was the loss of the partner who was the backbone economically of the family. With others, the question has been for both caregiver or children about what happened. And one, again, wants to respond in the most specific, factual way that one can, and where one doesn't have information, as Chief Redding was saying earlier, one says, we don't have that information, but let me see what I can find out. This is, again, about helping somebody sometimes walk through the steps about what's going to happen next, and having someone available who can help organize some of the next steps. And part of the role of the officer, the person doing the notification, is to be prepared to give some information about who needs to be notified, about arrangements, etc. Many times, parents are surprised when children receive the information, and rather than seeing the child overwhelmed with upset, the child, and we've seen this many, many times at different ages, the child will sit quietly, hear the information, and turn and say, can I go play now? And again, this is about helping the adults to recognize that children metabolize or digest overwhelming information in pieces at a time, and that this first discussion with them is not the last one, and to help them become aware that the process of grieving and mourning happens over a much longer stretch, and being able to help them pay attention and appreciate the different ways in which their children may give expression to the upset they're feeling, in even being able to, and as they're struggling to digest the fact that they are never going to see a loved one again, are some of the things that we can help orient parents to. And then, as Chief Redding was saying, also ensure that there are available supports after the officer leaves to help parents and caregivers follow not only their own reactions, but those of their children.
Just one other small point, that in notifying children, when we're preparing the caregivers to do that notification, and again, it's not a pleasant thing to do, but by focusing the parent or caregiver about notifying their child of the death of a loved one, we find that the more we get them focused on the child, the easier it is that you see them start to take the focus off themselves and their own upset, and becoming calmer, and say, you need to be calm. We need to have this information. We need to have this discussion about how this is going to be done. And a lot of times you see a change in them pretty quickly, like they start asking us questions, what should I say, how to say it. And again, just all the things that Dr. Marin spoke about, you know, that's important to get across, and they really come around to, you know, focusing on you and focusing on their own child, or if they're the caregiver of that child.
And one of the points that we had raised earlier, I was thinking about this situation where the upset of the adults, the caregivers and other family members, is so extensive that there's also the possibility that children can be overlooked. And Chief Redding and I were the people to give the official death notification on the death of a child, and therefore of a sibling, to 3 other children. And it was one of those situations where there are a good number of friends and family already gathered. They'd been waiting to find out whether the child had been discovered alive or not. And when we gave the information, the level of upset was quite substantial. And we noticed, as family members were offering support for the caregivers, that the siblings were in 3 parts of the room off by themselves. One boy who was about 9 or 10 stood in a corner with tears streaming down his cheeks. And it was not an opportunity that his mother was not in a place to be able to immediately console him. But by recognizing his presence and our being able to initiate contact with him, we were also then able to locate and identify an adult family member who we could then alert to what was going on for the child. And lastly, before we turn to questions, for children, children have their own version of the experience that the world is no longer the way it was and will never be the same again, which in large part is true. But also for children, when they see their parents, if the surviving parent, or they see the people who they turn to for stability, overwrought by the news of the death of a loved one, the worry is, what's going to happen to me? And being able to help children as well as their caregivers appreciate that taking care of each other doesn't mean not having feelings, but it does mean being aware that sometimes children can get very frightened when sometimes they're seeing for the first time their parents not being as in command as they're used to them being, and helping children appreciate that this will pass and that they will have help from their caregivers and others to navigate this very difficult time is an important reality to convey and communicate with both children and their caregivers. So I think with that, hearing from you all and seeing what questions you would like us to try to address with you, now would be a good time for that.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Mears, and thank you, Chief Reddy, for your presentation. And we certainly will like to open up the floor now for Q&A. So we do ask the audience, please feel free to submit your questions in the chat box, and we will get to them as soon as possible. I do have a few, 2 questions already, and there are more coming, so please continue to submit your questions. So let's see if I can. Okay, our first question, I'm just going to solicit some help from InTag. If you can move that question over for me so I can see the entire question, that would be great. Our first question is pertaining to training resources. I want to be able to make sure I can see the entire question. So give me just a second.
And hi, Tiffany. Remember, you can scroll the bar at the very bottom there to move.
Okay, thank you. You are so right. You're right. Excuse me, everyone. Technical issues here. Okay, so our first question is, do you have any suggested training resources? I have users who are working on a training program. So that's for both of you all to just kind of see if you had any initial thoughts, and then we can send some information you all's way.
So I think the first thing that we would suggest is having a look at the Protecting and Serving Trauma-Informed Policing toolkit that's available through IACP, and that's a good first step because in addition to the material, some of which we've covered today, there are also additional resources that are listed within that toolkit. That's where we would suggest starting.
Okay, excellent. All righty, so thank you, Dr. Mears. Our next question is, do you find that having a clergy member present is beneficial even without knowing the person's spiritual situation?
I think you go first.
I have been in the situation with clergy, and it has worked quite well. However, it was clergy that was known to the family member that I was given the death notification. I've also been in the situation where, like the hospital clergy just who came and was there, and it ended up being quite uncomfortable. And I was in that situation more times than I probably want it to be. Just personally, but I think the best practice is if you're going to have clergy, that they have some understanding of who the person is or some connection to the family.
Yeah, I would agree, and I think that certainly we always ask, and we always, teach our folks to always ask about whether there are, if they're members of a religious congregation, and whether they would like to be in touch or like us to help, make sure that their clergy person is aware. There are jurisdictions where the clergy are the people who've been turned to as a partner, and these are folks who in a non-denominational way have developed their own, wealth of experience, and in partnership with notifying officers can be
work quite well.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. Great. Next question. Would you recommend to inform a caregiver not in the presence of their child?
In the first instance, that's when we are able to do that, that's the first order of business.
That's optimal, if able.
Right. And remember, we've had many situations like this where either because the parent themselves is feeling unable to directly inform the child, or the caregiver wants the responding officer, in our case, the responding officer and clinician, to remain as they tell the child in order to both observe, help increase, address any questions or issues that come up immediately. So yes, the ideal situation is to be able to work with the parent, and often what we will say is, and questions will be, how do I tell my child? And we will give them some of the same information we've just conveyed to you. There are those situations where a parent will actually turn to us and say, could you please tell my child? And then we will do that, and we will do it obviously in the presence of the caregiver, and go from there.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Thank you. Thank you. Okay. And so we have another request about the link for the trauma toolkit. And so if you are interested in the toolkit, we're going to place the email address in the chat. It's CEZ@TheIACP. I'm going to put it in the chat right now, that you all email us your interest in the toolkit, and we can respond to your request for that. I'm placing it in the chat right now under Tiffany Garner. All right. So next question we have for presenters. Would you comment on the role of trained police chaplains?
Well, I mean, I think the first word that you said is what's most helpful is trained. Personally, in our department, we haven't had one in many, many years, but when I first started my career in law enforcement, we did have police chaplains, and we did train them in some counseling, not as extensive as we probably could have, but in those days we did. So I think that trained is the word. I think it could work well if that is your resource and you feel comfortable in doing that, and they have the principles of death notification. They know something about, especially in regards to children, something a little bit, enough about stages of development of children to help with identifying and being able to talk to caregivers who need to deal with children in the aftermath of this notification, because we do leave the scene and the caregivers are, and the next of kin are left there. You know, whatever information we can give them, and the trained clergy as well would be helpful.
Yeah, and there's a lovely, in the comments section, we do have a clergy colleague person who actually was spelling out some of the various ways in which in their role as being part of the notification team, the various functions that they're able to serve, which actually are enormously important, including being knowledgeable about next steps and actually being an assistance in moving forward with the next steps beyond the basic conveying of information about the death itself.
And also, as long as they know that there's so much information being given at that time of trauma that the caregivers or next of kin that you're speaking to may not remember all that we're giving them. It's just an overload of information that you are prepared to do follow-up, whether, in conjunction with whoever your partner is, in our case, the Yale Child Study, or your clergy, or your grief counselors, or your advocates, that you do that follow-up, because that information is just, there's so much of it. The ability for that person who has been traumatized to remember it all is not great. So, again, just follow-up.
Okay. All right, we're going to take about 2 more questions here. So our next question is, when notification of a child's death to multiple siblings, in your experience, is it better to do this with all of them at once or one at a time?
It's a great question, and there was another one about different developmental phases, and I think the two are important considerations. So, I'm thinking about a particular family where we, did a death notification in the way that we've described, and there were 4 children. The oldest was 11, the next was 9, the next was 7.5, and then the next one was 3. So here's the dilemma. For the older children, they are able to even have a concept as young and as that might be, but they have a concept of what death means. The 3-year-old, not so much. And so in this case, it was an example of talking with the 3 children with, in this case, it was the death of a father, and we talked first with the parent, and then we talked the mother, and then we talked with the mother with her 3 kids, while a relative was playing with the 3-year-old in another room, and then there was a discussion with the 3-year-old about all that was going on, and a very basic description of the upset that she was observing, and talking about the fact that Daddy was not going to be coming home. Again, in this case, as in so many cases, the notifier often feels a burden of trying to, as do parents who are in the midst of receiving awful news themselves, that everything has to be done in one fell swoop. And that, as any of us who've been through sudden deaths of loved ones know, there is no one fell swoop. That being able to be clear about what our tasks and what are the realities of what we can offer is very important in being able to then deliver what we can deliver in the best way possible. There's another question that I think is connected, which has to do with, do we automatically recommend grief services? Not necessarily, because again, it's digesting a bit at a time, which is why Chief Redding, Stephanie was suggesting much earlier, that the reason we do follow-ups is to ensure that there is contact to make sure that we can offer additional resources as the family is in a better place to pursue those when needed.
Okay. And I'm going to squeeze in one final question before we completely wrap up for today. Our last question is, how do you address parents who want to lie to their children in order to protect them from trauma? And we'll conclude with that.
We see that often. Yeah, that's a really easy question then. Not really. Again, that's in speaking with the parent, and sometimes, I've been asked by law enforcement colleagues why we train our officers in stages of development of children and the principles of of development and trauma-informed policing, this kind of speaks to this question. When we teach our officers why it's important, not to lie to children and what that does or doesn't do to the child, and then to get that across to the caregiver of why that may or may not be important, it's, we don't encourage the parents to lie to children, but we do encourage them to give the information that's age appropriate.
And on a very practical level, as we began this presentation, the idea of how overwhelming it is to people is really very, very important, because parents can be quite frightened of what they feel is their inability to tolerate and to see the level of suffering that they anticipate in their children. And so often on a practical level, the first question might be, why would you want to lie? What are you thinking about? And often it will be about, I want to spare them. And the simple response is, your children will be, the problem is that your children will be more alone with their feelings, if you're not able to demonstrate to them that you're in this together and that you're going to be there for them as they struggle with one of the worst possible pieces of reality, hopefully, that they will have to deal with in their young lives. And so, again, being able to appreciate what the motivation of parents lying is about as an opportunity to help them articulate their concerns about how they can or how they fear they won't be able to help their children. And being direct and opening the door and being available to hear what's on children's mind is the most critical way in which parents can support them at a time when they need their parents the most.
Even if they don't understand exactly what happened, they get an idea, a sense of it from the reactions of their parents or caregivers. They can see that something terrible has happened. So therefore, to be honest with them is the best way to go.
Thank you, Dr. Marins and Chief Redding. I just want to let you all know that the remaining questions that you all have, we will answer those. We will send those out via email to you to acknowledge that we did receive your questions, and we'll provide a response for you. All right, I'm going to turn it over to our INTAC team, William, to wrap us up for today, but we appreciate you all for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much, Tiffany. Thank you to Dr. Marin and also to Chief Redding for such a wonderful presentation. But before we wrap up, I just have some final announcements that I would like to let our audience know about. So please, everyone, be sure to join us for our next part of our webinar in the IACP webinar series. This webinar is coming up July 1st, 2019. From 1 to 2 p.m. Eastern Time. The title of this webinar is Frontline Officers' Role Interacting with Children at Domestic Violence Scenes. If you get a chance, please register for that. The registration link is on this slide and also located in the handout slide as well. If you have any questions, you may contact INTAC through our website displayed on this slide. You can stay up to date on the latest information for signing up for INTAC's TTA listserv, where we give you information about trainings such as these for the future. So please be sure to check us out on this slide and also check us out on Facebook. If you'd like to get in contact with OJJDP, please be sure to contact the help desk located on the information for this slide. If you have a TTA need, please be sure to submit a request via OJJDP's TTA 360 platform that's displayed on the link on this slide. A reminder for folks that the recording will be archived on our YouTube channel, where you're able to view past webinars. For event transcripts and supporting materials, please be sure to contact the OJJDP TTA Help Desk. Everyone, please take a moment to review this disclaimer. And lastly, we would appreciate it if you would take about 5 minutes to complete the feedback evaluation. Again, thank you all for joining us today. Have a great afternoon. Goodbye.